some countries, if you're breaking the law, the immigration law, you could be banned as an individual, but you could also be banned as a company, and you can have like a say 6 months ban or even longer. And I've seen that in my within my career of this last 16 years that companies have had these bans, and that could be quite have a significant impact to a company that's doing business selling their services maybe abroad, and suddenly they can't go for 6 months to sell their services or grow their business.
It might not be fair, but not all passports are created equal. If you're fortunate enough to be from a wealthy, stable country with great diplomatic relations, your passport can probably open doors to the majority of the world. But having a strong passport is far from the only consideration. Numerous countries now operate electronic travel authorization systems, including Canada, Australia, and the US, with the European Union's own system set to be launched in 2024. Add to that uncertain processing times, the complexities that blending business and leisure travel can bring, and the grey area of much digital nomad travel, when location-independent workers earn money on the road while being employed elsewhere. The issue becomes very murky indeed. So what are the hidden factors that dictate how easily you can gain entry to a country? Has the traditional visa system moved with the times to reflect the ways we travel in 2023? And what are the pitfalls both leisure and business travellers should watch out for? My name's Jack, and you're listening to Battleface Uncharted, a podcast brought to you by Battleface Travel Insurance. We speak to some of the travel industry's leading figures to discover the trends you need to know about. If you've got questions about visas, there are few companies more capable of answering them than CIBT. With more than 50 years experience, CIBT has become the largest and most well-established visa and passport company in the world, and we're proud to say one of our partners. Its customers include individual travellers, employees of some of the world's largest corporations, as well as customers of cruise lines, tour operators, and travel management companies. And last year, it assisted nearly 1 million people in obtaining the documents required for international travel. CIBT's Chief Strategy Officer, Carsten Ostberg, has more than 16 years' experience within the industry, holding multiple operational, commercial, and leadership roles. He's also worked within the leisure travel industry generally, including in Greece, Spain, and Egypt. Carsten, people often see their passport as the most important factor in gaining entry into a particular country, and perhaps they're right. But what are they missing in that equation?
Well, so the passport is certainly the most important still. It's more about are there any other documents nowadays that you need to have as well on top of the passport, and what kind of documents, and how much time does it take to procure them or find them in your belongings at home. That's probably the factor you need to calculate with as well. But the passport is still both number 1, 2, and 3, I would say, on the list.
So what are then the missteps that you see most commonly from travelers? How can people ensure that their visa application or their travel authorization stands the greatest chance of success?
That's really time, like how much time do you have available before your trip. So it's also really the number 1 reason for people getting their trip delayed, because they underestimate the time it takes to obtain a visa, for instance. It's often perceived as something that you just buy, and we hear applicants often using that word, I'm just going to buy a visa, whereas actually a foreign government kind of pre-approving your entry into their country, right? So the time that you need to obtain that visa and to have the right documents to get that visa is most often the reason for a delay and what people are missing before. And sometimes it could be the passport expiry date, etc. But it's really making sure you have enough time before your trip.
Is that processing time something that we've seen change? I mean, was it particularly extended, post-COVID, for example?
So post-COVID, when China reopened their borders in January, it certainly was there was a longer waiting time because you had travelers for waiting for about 2 years to go to China that suddenly want to go all of them at once. So obviously, it took more time to get the appointment, to submit your fingerprints in the countries where that's a requirement, get that appointments sorted. And then for other countries, I would say post-COVID, things are more or less back to normal. Whatever normal is can be anything from same day to 3 weeks, depending on where you're from, where you're going to, and for which purpose. But during COVID, it took a long time because you had to have a very specific reason for entering a country that otherwise would be closed for foreigners.
Got you. So, I mean, obviously, countries can change their entry rules at the drop of a hat. Are any countries now becoming much harder to gain entry to?
So this is very geopolitical area, right? Because it really depends on different governments getting along. And I think Brazil is the one that is the latest that is restating their visa program for certain nationalities from this autumn. So they are requiring an e-visa for American citizens, Australian citizens, Canadians, and Japanese citizens, which is something they haven't had for a number of years, not even during COVID. And now it's coming back. But so it really depends on the government. But that's the latest in on that list.
Do you find that most travelers are aware of these changes, or are these things that CIBT have to educate people on?
I think, I mean, some of them you definitely have to educate people on because, and let's face it, I mean, I've lived and breathed visas for 16 some years, and it's what I do. But if it's not what you do, it's nothing that is really super attractive as a topic to read up. So you do have to educate people. It's often once that due date, and for instance, for Brazil has set 1st of October as their starting date for when you need a visa again if you have one of those four nationalities. It's around that date that it kind of like becomes apparent that, oh, there's a visa requirement now that didn't exist before. And that's where we get the most questions right upon, a week before and then several months after.
Right. Yeah. I mean, speaking of kind of new travel authorizations, we're aware that the EU's travel information and authorization system is due to be launched in 2024. What are the implications here then for business and leisure travelers from non-EU countries?
So that's another topic to add to your to-do list before you travel, right? Remember your passport, remember your insurance, remember this or that. And this is just one of those that you have to add to the list and make sure you got, because it's not a super cumbersome process necessarily, but you do need to make sure that you check if you have to have the electronic authorization. It's likely going to be very similar to the US ESTA, but it's something that you have to kind of like again pay attention to before you go, because you wouldn't be able to board your flight if you don't have a valid one. And that's typical, for airlines to check that upon check-in or at least at boarding.
Are you expecting this will actually catch a lot of people out, or do you think that any kind of public announcements will kind of filter through to travelers on the ground?
So far it's been, because it's been delayed a number of times. So now people are a little bit like, yeah, it's coming at some point in the future, which is currently 2024. But it's I think it will probably through airlines be communicating, and through travel agencies and tour operators. I'm pretty sure they will do a lot of work to communicate that to their travelers, because it's really essential for them to be able to sell airline tickets or trips to have make sure people have that authorization in place.
Right. Yeah. Carsten, let's talk about digital nomads then. There are plenty of, what are called digital nomad visa schemes across the world. But there are also many digital nomads operating in a bit of a legal gray area, perhaps on tourist visas, wherever they are. Do you see that situation changing? Do you think the rules are going to be tightened up to prevent it?
Yeah, I do, because there are a number of countries that have official digital nomad visas or similar names at least, which is an official program you enter if you are intending to stay abroad, working for your company back in whatever country you're usually living in. And I think that's going to expand. We're going to see more of those programs being introduced. And if you follow that program, you should be good, right? Because you're following that foreign government process of obtaining a digital nomad visa. But especially in Europe, where a number of people might have a holiday home somewhere else in Europe, a number of people would likely be working from their laptop on their Wi-Fi, let's say in Spain, for instance, whilst actually living in the UK or elsewhere. And that's a risk. That's a risk for the individual, and that's a risk for the company that they're representing, because they need to count the number of days as well. There's a number of days you can stay in another country, typically 90 days in a 180-day period. So you need to make sure you keep on track on that, because that counts both for your leisure and business trips. So let's say you're staying in Spain for 30 days before going back to the UK if you're from the UK, and you're going on a business trip. Could be Spain as well. But then actually you spend then 30 days plus the number of days that you're spending on your business trip. You need to keep tracking that all the time, because if you overstay that, you're actually breaking the law of that country. That's in this case Spain as an example country.
Right. I guess this plays into it's at least similar to what we would call blended travel. So when people are combining, a leisure trip, they're also working, and it could be that they're attending a conference somewhere, but adding on a week to enjoy themselves. What are the implications here? I mean, is the visa system kind of set up for this type of travel, or is it a little outdated?
Well, right now, I think, many countries wouldn't necessarily know if you've been overstaying kind of in that country. It depends if there's a random check at the border, or if there's a workplace inspection, for instance. Let's say you're going to visit an office of yours in another country, and they do a workplace inspection, then that might appear. And then they will find out that actually you've been here more than you should have been without a visa. Because typically, at least within the EU, you wouldn't need a visa just to go from one EU country to another, or even, after Brexit, it's the same. If it's not work, and in this world of visas and immigration, work means something slightly different in each country. And when we say work, it's not me going to visit you in the UK for a chat and a meeting in your conference room and then go back. It could be, an example could be where you go to have a lecture at a conference or give a speech, and you're getting paid for it. That's often perceived as work. Whereas as an individual, when you think about work, you're like, I'm on a business trip, I'm working, which is, technically correct. But from an immigration perspective, it's not necessarily considered as work, which might grant you access to the country without any kind of visa or similar process in advance. But if you're not doing that and you're doing something else, and that country perceives that as work, then you are in a gray zone, and that's where it becomes tricky, and that's why you need professional advice.
Got you. Yeah. So look, in terms of corporate travel, then CIBT works with, I think, more than 2/3 of Fortune 500 companies. What are some of the trends you're seeing at the moment in terms of business travel?
Well, sustainability obviously is kind of like the hot topic right now. Like, you had risk management and duty of care a number of years ago, which is still super important for our clients. But sustainability is then resulting in maybe fewer trips but longer trips. So back to your point before, you might be staying there longer, but in many cases it might still be business. So that you go, let's say you go for an Asia tour to visit suppliers, for instance, or partners, and you might do more countries whilst out there, and then you come back instead of going back and forth a number of times, because of your carbon footprint, for instance. So instead of going back and forth to a number of countries several times, you just want to go once but stay a little bit longer. That's one of the things we see more. Then risk management and duty of care is still really key, and a number of clients are being more cautious about the compliance than ever before. I'm not saying that we're not compliant before, but it's becoming more apparent with COVID and the way the entry requirements were changing, and not necessarily only talking about visas, but also like all those documents you had to provide during COVID, the number of days again you can spend, all those things that we touched upon earlier in this one. So a lot of companies are now more concerned about the compliance part that they might have been before. And that's key to us as well, because that's really our sweet spot as well, because we can give you that advice on what is the correct approach to this to be compliant. And this is what you need to obtain in order to follow the rules and the regulations, and not having, risking your company's reputational damage, or even a travel ban, because some countries, if you're breaking the law, the immigration law, you could be banned as an individual, but you could also be banned as a company, and you can have like a 6 months ban or even longer. And I've seen that in my within my career of this last 16 years, that companies have had these bans, and that could be quite have a significant impact to a company that's doing business, selling their services maybe abroad, and suddenly they can't go for 6 months to sell their services or grow their business, whatever the purpose is, because they did something that they didn't intend to do necessarily, but they were caught out on it, and then the immigration officer reported it, and it went to a ban. Or individuals get banned, and individuals that could be very key to the company's success in that country, that's also a problem. Or in worst case, to detention.
Wow. I mean, you mentioned COVID there, and I guess the sort of changing requirements that brought in. We saw in COVID many countries insist on mandatory travel insurance as a condition for entry. Do you think this is something that will continue? Will more countries adopt this requirement?
Yes, I do think so. We saw a little bit pre-COVID as well, but COVID obviously was the big game changer for that mandatory travel insurance. But we've also seen countries post-COVID introducing a mandatory travel insurance as a requirement to enter their country, but not a visa. It's still visa free for most nationals, but it could be that you still need you need a travel insurance. And I think, many countries were struggling maybe with their healthcare systems before COVID, and COVID obviously really made most countries struggle. And what if there's a new pandemic or something similar that is putting a lot of pressure on the healthcare system, and then you got a number of foreigners in the country, who's going to pay their bill for that medical need they might have had whilst visiting your country? And that's where I think the travel insurance is super important for, obviously the individual to feel safe when traveling, but also for the countries to ensure that individual actually have something to take care of them in case there is an accident, or there's another pandemic, or there's something else that requires medical attention. So yes, I think that's here to stay. We'll see more countries.
You've been listening to Battleface Uncharted, brought to you by Battleface Travel Insurance.